Okay, so today we're going to be looking at this pretty fiery debate, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
surrounding the U.S. and UK and kind of the Western world's economies in general.
Yeah.
And this all stems from an episode of The Diary of a CEO on YouTube.
Okay.
And he had on two guests. One is an economist who has a pretty good track record of predicting economic downturns and kind of making money off of that as well.
Okay.
And then he also has on a very successful entrepreneur and investor.
Got it.
And so our goal today is going to be to look at the kind of contrasting viewpoints of those two individuals as they discuss why it seems like so many people are getting poorer these days and what can be done about it.
Okay.
So the real kind of, I guess, crux of the matter is whether it is the individual's lack of entrepreneurial spirit, let's say, or drive, or whether it's actually systemic issues.
Right.
Like governmental policies, wealth inequality.
The big one.
Technology, so that's what we're going to be unpacking today.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so the first expert that I'll bring up is The Economist.
Right.
And he has, he's made a lot of wealth by betting on the collapse of Western society, basically.
Getting against the house.
He's betting against the house, and it's been working out for him so far.
So far.
Yeah.
What a way to live.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's...
Not the most optimistic way to live, but...
No, but I mean, if it works for him.
Yeah. Well, and he seems to think it's going to keep working for him.
Okay.
Because he's still betting against the house.
Gotcha.
But so he sees a very... he's very concerned, I guess you could say, about wealth inequality.
Yeah.
And he essentially says that if the rich keep getting richer,
right,
which they are,
well, yeah,
then the middle class and the poor are going to continue to get squeezed out of things like housing and just basic living.
Necessities.
Yeah. And he thinks that the solution to that is to cut taxes on working people and raise taxes on the wealthiest.
The classic Robin Hood theory.
Yeah.
Right. Take from the rich and give to the poor.
Yep. And then the other side of that coin is the entrepreneur and investor who grew up in an area where there was high unemployment, low income, and was able to make his way to the top, building up a bunch of technology and education businesses.
Yeah.
And he kind of looks at it as a little bit more a simpler viewpoint than The Economist.
Yeah.
And his kind of points are big governments, record taxes, outdated schooling, technology, and remote working are kind of eroding economic freedoms.
Okay.
That's the way he looks at it.
Gotcha.
So he essentially wants lower taxes.
Of course.
And less regulation.
Right.
So that there can be more wealth created.
Sounds like a typical entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, they kind of, they disagree.
With each other.
Of course that's how these things are set up.
Yeah, well, this was pretty funny because The Economist pretty quickly dismisses the entrepreneur's ideas as an overly simplified view.
So he's very much in favor of the Robin Hood tax scheme.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the entrepreneur kind of fires back. He's like, oh, wow, why are you so focused on wealth inequality?
Right. Like, what about all these other issues?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pretty early on, it's clear that they're not going to see eye to eye on things.
Okay.
But the Economist paints a picture of where he sees the UK and US going.
Right.
And he uses South Africa and Nigeria as examples.
Oh, wow.
Where there is such extreme wealth inequality that it's basically the rich just live in gated communities and the poor kind of just left to fend for themselves.
Yeah.
And so his real concern is that if we don't get this under control, the UK and the US are going to start looking a lot like that. So he's basically saying it's... the U.S. and the U.K. are on a path to becoming third world countries.
That's basically his argument, yeah.
Okay.
And then the entrepreneur kind of combats that by saying, well, I grew up in an area with low income, very high unemployment.
Yeah.
And I was able to start working at McDonald's, and I built my way up to having multiple businesses in technology and education, and I'm now a multimillionaire.
The classic American dream.
The classic American dream.
Pulling yourself up by the bootstraps.
Yep.
Okay.
So he's saying it is possible.
Right.
It's not all doom and gloom.
Gotcha.
There are opportunities out there.
So are they both British, or is the entrepreneur American?
They're both British. This is in the UK.
Okay.
But I mean, I think it applies to the US too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, both of them actually kind of agree that we are in an interesting time economically.
Right.
Because the Entrepreneur actually quotes Charles Dickens.
Oh, wow.
He says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's really how it is because, you know, you've got people who are just killing it. Right. Especially in the digital economy right now.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you've got people who are getting priced out of their houses.
Right.
Food costs are going up.
Yeah.
Energy costs are insane.
Exactly.
So it really is kind of this weird duality going on.
Interesting.
The Entrepreneur, in order to kind of support his points about less regulation, brings up the Economic Freedom Index.
Okay.
But I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Not off the top of my head, no.
So essentially, it's a way of measuring how economically free a country is.
Okay.
And so they look at things like property rights, the size of government, regulatory efficiency, openness to trade, that kind of thing.
So basically how easy it is to do business there.
Exactly.
Yep.
And he points out that there is a strong correlation between high economic freedom and low poverty rates.
Okay.
And vice versa.
Makes sense.
So the less economic freedom you have, the more poverty you have generally.
So like a more socialist country would have less economic freedom and more poverty?
That's what the index would suggest, yeah.
Okay.
Now, they both kind of bring up technology as being a major factor in all of this, but they come at it from different angles.
Makes sense.
The Entrepreneur looks at technology as a reason why some people are getting wealthier and some people are staying the same or even getting poorer.
Yeah.
And he calls this the tech divide.
The tech divide.
So essentially he's saying that those in tech and media tech and finance are doing incredibly well.
Of course.
But a lot of other people are kind of getting left behind.
Yeah.
And then another thing that comes up that I think is a really big one is the housing crisis.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's a crisis in the U.S. and the UK for sure.
For sure, yeah.
And so the Entrepreneur describes it in the UK as a housing traffic jam.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because you've got millions of homes that are underoccupied, which are mostly owned by older generations.
Right.
And that's creating a real problem for younger people because they can't afford to get into the market.
Especially when the older generation like refuses to downsize or, you know.
Right.
Sell their homes or whatever. Yeah.
And on top of that, they bring up a statistic that's really surprising.
Okay.
Apparently, a high net worth individual leaves the UK every 45 minutes.
Wow.
So that's a lot of millionaires leaving the UK.
Yeah, mass exodus of the wealthy.
Yeah.
So why is that?
Well, the Entrepreneur kind of looks at it as the UK economy is just weakening.
Right.
The average family just doesn't have the spending power they used to. And so it's just not a very attractive place to live anymore from his point of view.
Okay.
But The Economist looks at it and says, well, this is because they got rid of the non-dom tax scheme.
Okay.
So the non-dom tax scheme basically allowed wealthy people who were living in the UK but were domiciled elsewhere to not pay taxes on a lot of their income.
Oh, wow. So they're not really UK citizens. They just live there.
Right. Oh. So a lot of wealthy people would move to the UK and they would say, okay, well, my domicile is actually, you know, the Bahamas or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I don't have to pay taxes in the UK on my income that I'm making elsewhere.
Wow. Okay. So they closed that loophole. And now the wealthy are leaving.
Exactly. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So now the Entrepreneur kind of makes this distinction between wealth creation and wealth extraction.
Okay.
So he defines wealth creation as innovation and building new businesses. Yeah. Actually generating something new.
So creating something from nothing, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas wealth extraction he defines as kind of just trading in existing markets. Yeah. Or kind of taking advantage of existing assets.
Yeah, okay.
So he's very much in favor of wealth creation.
Of course, obviously. As any entrepreneur would be.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now they kind of go on a little bit of a historical tangent. Oh, yeah. And they look at tax rates in the past.
Okay.
In the UK and the US.
Right.
And they mentioned that back in like the mid-1900s, there were times when tax rates for the highest earners were like 80-90%.
Wow.
Crazy high.
Yeah.
And so they kind of debate whether that was good for the economy or not.
Right.
And, they have different opinions.
Of course they do.
As always.
Yeah.
But yeah, so now another kind of big point of contention is how much the government should be spending.
Right.
And so they talk about the current government spending in the UK as a percentage of GDP.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, GDP is gross domestic product.
Right.
And it's basically the value of all the goods and services produced in a country.
Okay.
So in the UK, it's currently around 45%.
45%.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And they kind of debate back and forth on whether that's too high or too low.
Right.
And they look at examples like the U.S. has been doing a lot of deficit spending.
Yeah.
And the U.K. has had some austerity measures. And they're kind of just debating on whether that was good or bad.
So basically, one of them is probably saying that more government spending leads to a better economy.
Right.
And the other is saying the opposite.
Yeah, that less government spending leads to a better economy.
Okay.
Now, one thing they do both agree on is that remote work is becoming a big factor.
Yeah.
And they both see it as a potential problem.
Okay.
Because it could lead to jobs leaving the UK.
Right. And going to countries where labor is cheaper.
Of course, yeah.
So if you can have somebody in India doing your job for a fraction of the cost,
right.
then why wouldn't you?
That's what a business owner's going to think, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So they both see that as a potential problem.
Gotcha.
And of course, the age-old debate about taxing the wealthy comes up.
Right.
And they talk about how difficult it is to tax assets that are highly mobile. Like, you can just move your money out of the UK and into another country pretty easily these days.
If you're wealthy enough, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the entrepreneur warns that if you tax the wealthy too much, they're just going to leave.
They're going to take their ball and go home, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's going to hurt the UK economy because they're not going to be investing their money there.
Right.
They're not going to be creating businesses there.
So he's basically saying, don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. That's basically, that's his argument.
Okay.
Now, this leads to kind of a heated debate about inheritance tax.
Okay.
The Economist is very much in favor of taxing inheritance.
Yeah.
He thinks it's unfair that you can inherit a ton of money and not have to pay much tax on it.
Right.
Especially when you compare that to somebody who's working and they have to pay a huge percentage of their income in taxes.
Okay.
So he sees that as just inherently unfair.
Yeah, it does seem a bit unfair.
Yeah.
If you put it that way.
They briefly touch on alternative tax models.
Okay.
Like consumption taxes. So taxing spending rather than income or wealth.
Okay.
But they also point out that it's very difficult to tax the profits of multinational corporations.
Right.
Because they can just shift their money all over the world.
Yeah, they just hide it in different shell companies in different countries.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of a tough problem to solve.
It sounds like it.
Now, the entrepreneur kind of brings it back to his main point, which is economic freedom. And he actually shows a diagram on the screen that shows a really strong inverse correlation between economic freedom and poverty rates.
Gotcha.
So again, the more economic freedom you have, the less poverty you have generally.
Makes sense.
And then to kind of illustrate his point, he gives an example of a company that he knows of that had to not give pay raises to their employees because of an increase in national insurance.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is kind of like a tax in the UK, I guess.
Yeah.
So he's saying that these taxes actually hurt the people that they're trying to help.
Right. By taking money out of the pockets of businesses, and then the businesses can't pay their employees.
Exactly.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So then they go on to kind of do a little bit of back of the napkin math.
Okay.
And they're trying to figure out, okay, well, if we were to implement a 1% wealth tax on everybody who has assets over 10 million pounds.
Right.
How much money would that actually generate?
Yeah.
And their conclusion is that it wouldn't actually generate that much money, especially when you compare it to the overall government spending.
Right.
So their point is that the UK has some big financial problems that aren't going to be solved by just taxing the wealthy.
Yeah.
So then they come back to, okay, well, where is all the wealth going?
Right.
And they mention that the top 7 U.S. tech companies have increased in value by $11 trillion since the start of the pandemic.
Wow.
That's insane.
That's a lot of money going to a very small amount of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it just shows that there is a massive concentration of wealth happening in the tech sector.
Yeah.
And then they kind of bring it back to the UK.
Yeah.
And they talk about how the UK doesn't really have any equivalent tech giants to the US or China.
Like we have Google and Apple, and they have Alibaba and Tencent. And the UK doesn't really have anything like that.
They don't have anything like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And so they talk about what needs to happen for that to change. You know, do they need more investment? Do they need to retain their talent better? Those kinds of things.
Interesting.
And then they look ahead to the future.
Yeah.
And they talk about how AI is going to be a huge disruptor in a lot of industries.
Yeah.
And their concern is that the U.S. and China are really leading that revolution.
Right.
And so the UK is kind of at risk of falling behind.
Yeah, being left in the dust.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now this kind of comes to, I guess, the main point of disagreement between the two. Okay. And that is entrepreneurship actually a viable option for the average person?
Right.
The Economist is very skeptical of that. He thinks that there are just too many systemic issues in place that make it really difficult for someone to actually build a successful business.
Okay.
Whereas the entrepreneur obviously believes that it is possible.
Of course.
Because he did it.
He's living proof.
Right.
Right.
He does say, though, that you need the right mindset, the right skills.
Right.
And you need to be able to identify the opportunities that are out there.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, that's a big disagreement between the two is whether entrepreneurship is actually a viable option for most people.
Yeah. I mean, they're both coming at it from completely different backgrounds and perspectives. So it makes sense that they would disagree on that.
Yeah. And the entrepreneur is actually pretty critical of the traditional education system.
Okay.
He says that it's not really preparing young people for the modern economy, for the realities of
the technology and
the tech world that we live in.
Yeah, okay.
And he even says that it can kind of penalize entrepreneurial tendencies.
Right.
Because you're told to kind of follow the rules, get good grades,
go to a good school,
get a good job.
Right.
And that's not really how you build a business.
Yeah.
So he thinks that the education system needs some reform.
Okay.
Now, The Economist uses a really interesting analogy.
Yeah.
He talks about shrinking seats on the lifeboat.
Shrinking seats on the lifeboat. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he's basically saying that it's just becoming more and more difficult for young people to achieve financial security.
Yeah.
Even if they're working hard.
Right.
Even if they're doing everything right.
Yeah.
There's just not enough room
Gotcha.
on the lifeboat anymore. So they kind of debate that point a little bit.
Right.
And then they talk about, the balance between personal responsibility and systemic change.
Okay.
And they both agree that personal effort is important.
Right.
But they disagree on how much systemic issues are holding people back.
Yeah. Okay.
So The Economist basically ends by saying, okay, look, we need to push for political change.
Okay.
We need to lower taxes on working people.
Right.
And we need to raise taxes on the wealthy.
Okay.
And he says that throughout history, it's always been the people who have pushed for change, and they've been able to get a fairer share.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of his message.
Okay.
And then when it comes to advice for young people, The Economist kind of says, look, it's going to get worse.
Okay.
You need to work hard, but it's going to be an uphill battle because the system is against you.
Good.
Whereas the entrepreneur kind of says, look, you need to be knowledgeable about the new technological revolution that's happening. Yeah. And you need to be able to identify the opportunities that are coming up.
Gotcha.
And so they kind of have different approaches to that as well.
Interesting.
But the Economist makes one final point, which is that we can't just think individualistically.
Okay.
He says that if the middle class collapses, it's going to hurt everybody and the wealthy.
Right.
So his argument is that we need to protect society as a whole.
Yeah.
And he ends by saying, politics isn't a game. You need to vote.
Yeah.
And you need to vote for policies that are going to protect your financial interests.
Right.
which he sees as taxing the wealthy more and the working people less.
So, yeah, like the classic Robin Hood theory.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that was kind of the main points of that debate.
So it sounds like we really got to see two very different perspectives.
Yeah.
On the challenges facing, like you said, the average person in these economies today.
Yeah.
We had the economist who's very concerned about wealth inequality
right.
and, advocates for taxing the wealthy and redistributing that wealth.
Yeah.
And then we had the entrepreneur
right.
who believes in individual initiative and economic freedom.
Yeah.
And essentially thinks that the best way to improve everyone's lives is to lower taxes and deregulate.
Exactly.
Okay.
So a few key takeaways, I think, for the listener would be,
yeah.
First of all, they both seem to agree that wealth inequality is a big problem.
Right.
They just disagree on how to solve it.
Yeah.
But they both acknowledge that it's a serious issue that could have major negative consequences for the majority of the population.
Yeah.
And they both agree that technology is a huge disruptor. And that it's creating new opportunities, but it's also potentially displacing a lot of people.
Right.
So it's important to understand how those shifts are happening and how to adapt to them.
That's sure.
And then they also both agree that the housing market is a major barrier to wealth building,
right?
Particularly for younger generations.
Yeah.
And then they also kind of highlighted the fact that tax policies and government spending have a huge impact on the economy.
Yeah.
And that it's not always clear what the best approach is.
Yeah.
But it's something that we need to be paying attention to.
Exactly.
And then finally, they both kind of emphasize the importance of individual effort